The infant was not supposed to be alive. That was what Orla had been told, quietly and without ceremony, when they brought him to her in the grey hour before the castle woke. The Alpha King's son, 3 days old, blue at the lips. Alpha King Leofric of Kerth, whose court had spent 2 years preparing the formal selection of a queen and mate, and whose heir had now arrived before that selection was complete, lay sleeping in the upper quarters, while his son lay in Orla's arms in the lower ward, breathing in the shallow intervals of something that has nearly stopped. The woman who handed the infant over, one of Lady Corveth's attendants, face carefully neutral, eyes that had stopped expecting good news some hours ago, said only that the court healers had done everything they could, and then she left before Orla could ask her to clarify what everything meant. Orla set down the iron-bound ledger she had been carrying and took the child. She had carried that ledger every morning for 4 years. It was narrow and water-stained, its cover reinforced with 2 iron clasps shaped like wolf heads biting down, and its pages held a record of every draft prepared, every compound measured, every patient treated in the lower quarters of Kerth Hold, since she had arrived as an apprentice healer at the age of 16. The court's healers did not use such books. They carried knowledge in their heads, where it could be revised without witnesses and adjusted to match whatever outcome had occurred. Orla had found, over 4 winters, that ink had a longer memory than most men, and that most men did not think to be careful about what they said in front of someone they had stopped seeing. The ledger was also, though no one at Kerth knew this yet, the most dangerous object in the lower ward. She held the infant against her shoulder and placed 2 fingers beneath the shelf of his jaw, above the soft hollow where the pulse lived. It was present, faint as a moth's wing testing a flame, and arrhythmic in the way that meant the body was working too hard to maintain rhythm, but present. His chest rose in shallow, laboured intervals. His lips, when she turned him toward the morning light from the high stone window, were the colour of a bruise 2 days old. His face was a contorted knot of effort, not distress exactly, but the specific expression of something fighting for the use of itself. She understood immediately what was wrong, because she had seen it once before, in a shepherd's child in the village outside the eastern wall 4 winters past, and that child had lived because Orla had been there, and had done what the village healer hadn't thought to do. She did not call for anyone. She did not send to the court healers. She went to the corner of the lower ward, where her cabinet of compounds stood locked with a key she kept on a cord at her wrist, alongside the iron clasps of the ledger, and she unlocked it, and she lit the small tallow candle she kept on the cabinet's top, and she began. The lower ward was quiet in the early morning. It smelled of dried herbs and tallow smoke, and the cold that came up through the stone floors, no matter what the season. The high window threw a pale rectangle of light across the flagstones. Orla worked without hurrying, which was not the same as working slowly. She had prepared this particular compound twice, once for the shepherd's child, and once 2 years later, when she had thought it through again and written the preparation down more precisely, and her hands knew the movements, the way hands learn things that the mind considers important. The child was in her arms throughout. She adjusted her hold continuously, keeping him upright, keeping pressure circulating through his back and sides. He was very small. She had no children of her own, and had not held many infants. But the weight of him was not abstract to her. It was present and specific, and required her full attention, which she gave it. Alpha King Leofric of Kerth heard his son cry for the first time from the corridor outside the lower ward. He had been awake for 3 days. His counsellors had the look of men who had stopped expecting good news and begun managing the logistics of its absence. The succession protocols, the quiet correspondence with the Eastern lords who would need reassurance, the careful silence that had settled around Lady Corveth's apartments, where the child's mother lay with a fever that had broken at dawn and left her pale and drained and bewildered. Leofric had dismissed the council at midnight. He had dismissed the court healers at 2 hours past it. He had spent the remaining dark hours in the long corridor between the great hall and the East Wing in the way that men like him, men who have spent their lives solving problems, spend the hours in which there is no problem to solve, only waiting. He was 6 feet and 4 inches of trained stillness. He had a scar along the left side of his jaw, old and silver, the kind you get from something swift and forget about, while everyone around you remembers it. Dark hair, close cut at the sides, and slightly disordered on top in the way of someone who has not slept in 3 days and no longer cares about it. Eyes that council members described, privately and with some difficulty, as the colour of a decision already made. He had 32 years of practice at being the largest weight in any room he entered, and he had learned to enter rooms carefully because a room that had already braced itself told him nothing useful. He heard the cry and walked toward it. It was not a decision. He understood this later, that it had not felt like choosing. The sound of his son's voice, which he had never heard before, pulled at something in him that had nothing to do with governance or succession, and he walked toward it down the stone corridor with his heart doing something he did not have a name for. The door to the lower ward was open. He stopped in the doorway. Inside, a young woman he did not recognize was standing with his son pressed against her left shoulder, her right hand moving in firm, deliberate circles on the child's back. The child was crying in the particular outraged key of something that has recently discovered it wants to live, and is furious about the difficulty. She did not turn when Leofric entered. She was watching the child's face with the focused, narrow attention of someone performing a procedure. Not tenderness, or not tenderness alone, the specific quality of alertness belonging to people who know that a moment lapsed is a moment lost, and who have decided not to lapse any. She was perhaps 20 years old, dark brown hair braided at the nape of her neck, and already coming loose with the morning's work. A strand of it crossed over her ear. A plain-spun grey dress that had seen considerable use, its cuffs worn soft. An iron-clasped ledger lying open on the cabinet behind her, its pages covered in close, careful script that from where he stood he could not read. Her wrists, where the sleeves had been pushed back, were marked with ink in 2 or 3 places. Not accidental, but the trace of someone who writes quickly and precisely, and does not always notice when the quill catches her skin. Boots, with a split seam along the left heel. He stood in the doorway and did not speak, because he was afraid that if he spoke, she would stop doing what she was doing, and the sound of his son's crying was the most extraordinary thing he had heard in 3 days, and he did not want it to stop. The child cried. She kept her hand moving in its steady, practiced circles. She said, not to Leofric, not to the child, but to herself, in a low and certain voice that had no performance in it. There you are. She had not known the Alpha King was standing behind her. She found this out when she turned to make her note in the ledger. And there he was, filling the doorway in a way that was not dramatic, simply physical. The way very tall people fill doorways, which is to say completely. He was wearing a dark tunic that would have cost 6 months of her wages, and he was holding himself with the absolute stillness of someone who has learned that stillness is its own kind of force. He looked like a man who had not slept, and also like a man who had decided some time ago that sleep was a problem to be addressed later, and whose later had not yet arrived. His eyes were on the child. Orla tightened her hold and said, precisely, he had a mucus obstruction and a suppressed cough reflex. The cough reflex suppression appears to have been compound-induced, though I have not yet confirmed the source. He is breathing now, properly, and at an improving rate. He will need to remain upright for another hour at minimum. I have noted the compound I administered on page 47 of the ledger, along with the preparation method and the dosing calculation for his weight. If you have questions about any of those decisions, I can answer them. Leofric looked at his son. His son's face, which had been the colour of old bruises when Orla received him an hour ago, was now red and actively indignant, in the way of healthy infants who have opinions about the temperature of the world and the insufficiency of their current arrangements. He was breathing with the determination of something that has been reminded of its own stubbornness and has taken it personally. "What is your name?" Leofric said. "Orla. I am the lower ward healer. I have been here 4 years. She hesitated for precisely the length of time it took her to decide that he had the right to know this, and that there was no useful reason to soften it. "An Alpha King's son has not been brought to the lower ward before. I would have liked more warning, and I would have liked to know what the court healers had already administered. I worked from observation alone." He looked at her then, fully, in the way of someone who has recalibrated a measurement and found it unexpectedly significant. "The court healers said there was nothing to be done. They were correct," Orla said, "that they could not do it." She paused, not for effect, but because the next sentence required accuracy. "That is not the same thing." The child made a sound against her shoulder that was smaller and more settled than crying, not distress, but presence, as if he had established his position and was now comfortable holding it. Leofric held out his hands. She transferred the infant to him with specific instruction on the angle of support. She placed his hands herself, firmly and without apology, and he received the child with the sureness she had not expected. Men who are accustomed to holding large and heavy things are sometimes unexpectedly precise with small ones. He held his son against his chest, and something in his face moved through 3 or 4 things she could not name in the time it took her to look away. "What is in the ledger?" he said. She met his eyes. "Everything I have done since I arrived at Kerth. Every preparation, every patient, every outcome." She paused. "And some things I have observed that I was not asked to observe, and that no one asked me to record." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a question being considered by someone who understood its weight. "I will send for you," Leofric said. "I will be here," Orla said. "I am always here." She had not been lying about that. 4 years at Kerth Hold had given Orla a geography of the castle that no one else possessed, not because she was exceptional, but because she was unremarkable, and unremarkable people are permitted to go everywhere. She had walked every corridor in the lower castle, and the servants' passages that ran behind the great hall walls, and the archivists' alcoves, where old Fenwick kept his records in towers of vellum that smelled of damp stone and careful forgetting. She knew which steps on the east stair had been recently replaced, because she had watched the masons work while she waited to see a patient in the upper corridor. She knew which of the kitchen staff left early on Wednesdays and why. She knew the names of the 3 children in the East Groom's quarters who had recurring chest infections, and what compounds helped them and what didn't. She also knew, though she had not been asked and had told no one, that the supply records for the court healer's compound cabinet did not match the amounts listed in their quarterly reports. She had begun noticing this 11 months ago. It had not alarmed her immediately. Record-keeping is imprecise. Compounds are sometimes spilled or spoiled. Quantities vary with preparation method. She had watched for 3 months before she began writing it down. By the 6th month, she had a pattern. By the 9th month, she had a name for the compound that was appearing in the cabinet, in excess of what any treatment plan she could identify would account for. It was a compound used legitimately in very small quantities to ease difficult labors. In larger quantities, over time, administered before or during a birth, it suppressed the infant's cough reflex. She had written this on page 31 of the ledger. She had written it clearly, in the same careful hand she used for everything, and she had locked the cabinet and kept the key on the cord at her wrist, and not said anything to anyone because she had nothing yet but her own records, and her own records were the records of a lower ward healer who slept in the secondary quarters and 8 at the second sitting, and was, as far as this court was concerned, not quite a person whose records would be heard. She had understood this about herself for 4 years. She had made a careful peace with it. She had also kept writing. On the 5th morning, after the infant breathed freely for the first time, old Fenwick came to the lower ward himself, a thing he had never done in 4 years, because archivists do not leave their archives for small matters. He was a dry, spare man, with the watchful eyes of someone who has observed a great many things, and kept most of them to himself. He stood in the doorway, and looked at the wolf-born infant in Orla's arms, and at the small creature resting across her feet, the child's wolf, which had found her on the 2nd morning, and had not reconsidered since. "I have been at Kerth 40 years, Fenwick said, "and I have not seen that." "I am told it is unusual," Orla said. "The last time a wolf-born heir chose a companion not of the ranked houses," Fenwick said, "the records put it at 427 years ago, the last Alpha Queen." He looked at her over the infant's head with the expression of someone delivering information he considers important and is not certain will be understood. "I thought you should know that, since it appears that no one else has thought to tell you." Orla looked down at the creature sleeping across her boots. It was small still, and its ears were too large, and it was breathing in the slow, easy rhythm of something that has made a decision and is at peace with it. "Thank you," she said. "I have noted it." Fenwick nodded once, and went back to his archive. The court healer was Lady Corveth's cousin. Lady Corveth herself was a different matter. She was 30 years old and beautiful, in the specific, considered way of a woman who has thought hard about how to be seen and has succeeded. Dark hair dressed elaborately, always. Clothing that was never ostentatious, too clever for that, but precisely correct for every occasion, in a way that demonstrated that she had thought about every occasion and its requirements. She had been at Leofric's court for 2 years, positioned there by her family, supported by 3 council alliances, and a petition from the eastern lords that cited her bloodline and her management of her family's estate. She was publicly kind. Orla had watched her for 2 years, and had never seen her do anything that could be directly called cruel. What she did was structural. What she did was procedural. What she did was use the mechanisms available to her with the competence of someone who had been planning for a long time and did not intend to fail. Orla did not dislike her for this. She had, in some remote part of herself, a professional appreciation for the precision of it. She simply had a ledger. The summons to the council chamber came 6 days after the infant's breathing had stabilized, and the child's daily improvement had become something the castle could talk about openly, with the particular warmth that castles reserve for good news after a stretch of bad. It was not sent by Leofric. The evening before the hearing, Orla was walking the east corridor with the ledger under her arm when 2 of Lady Corveth's household guard stepped from the alcove at the stairs turning and blocked her way. They were not armed, or rather, they were armed, but their hands were at their sides, which was a careful distinction. The larger of the 2 said that Lady Corveth wished to speak with her, that it would be in Orla's interest to attend, that the ledger, perhaps, might be more comfortable left in the lower ward rather than carried through the castle at this hour. Orla looked at the 2 men, and then at the ledger, and then at the corridor behind her, where the nearest inhabited room was 40 feet away. She said, "Tell Lady Corveth that I will be happy to speak with her in the council chamber tomorrow morning, in front of the full council. I find that conversations are clearer when they are conducted before witnesses." There was a pause. The larger man looked at the smaller one. She walked past them. Her hands did not shake, though her heart was doing something rapid and sustained until she reached the lower ward and locked the door. She set the ledger on the cabinet and stood with her back to it for a long moment, breathing. Then she took out her quill and made a note on page 42 of the time, the location, and the name she had recognized from the household rolls. In the morning she carried the ledger to the council chamber as she had intended. The council chamber was on the second floor of the main keep, where the stone floors were swept clean, and the tapestries on the walls depicted old victories, and the chairs around the long table were carved with wolf-head arms in the old style. 14 chairs. The room smelled of beeswax and aged oak, and the particular tension of formal proceedings. Orla arrived carrying the iron-clasped ledger. She had dressed carefully, her best grey dress, which was not very fine by the standards of anyone in this room, but was clean and whole, and her boots, which still had the split seam along the left heel, because she had not yet repaired it, and had decided this morning that she was not going to pretend she had. She had braided her hair twice and pinned it properly. Lady Corveth was already seated on the left side of the table. She wore deep blue wool, with a border of silver thread, and a circlet of worked silver that was not excessive, and was therefore more effective than excess would have been. She held herself with the composed attention of a woman who has arranged a room to her advantage, and is now simply waiting to demonstrate what that advantage is. When Orla entered, Lady Corveth did not look at her directly. She looked at the table. The petition was 4 pages, formally worded in the court's legal style, bearing Lady Corveth's seal in blue wax. It argued that Orla had exceeded the authority of her appointment in treating the Alpha King's son without authorization or oversight, that the compound she had administered had not been reviewed or approved by the Court Healer's Council, that the welfare of the heir required that access to him be restricted to those of appropriate station and formal qualification, and that the lower ward healer's conduct required investigation and appropriate consequence. It was, Orla had thought when she read it the previous evening, a very clean piece of institutional work. Everything in it was technically arguable. None of it mentioned compounds. Orla sat where she was shown, and set the ledger on the table in front of her. "I understand," she said, addressing the council rather than Lady Corveth, "that I am here to account for my conduct on the morning of the 3rd day. I am prepared to do that fully." She placed her left hand flat on the ledger's cover, over the iron clasps. "I would also request that the council consider the contents of this ledger, specifically pages 31 through 36, before reaching any determination." The eldest councillor, who had the face of a man who had seen many proceedings and had tired of most of them, looked at her over the table. "What do those pages contain?" "A record of discrepancies in the Court Healer's compound cabinet," Orla said, "documented over 11 months. The room produced the particular silence of a space in which something has shifted, and no one has yet decided how to respond." Lady Corveth said, smoothly and without any apparent agitation, "The council might observe that the lower ward healer has produced a document of her own making, unsupported by any external authority, as justification for conduct that—" "The records are not justification for my conduct," Orla said. "My conduct requires no justification." He was not breathing. I treated him. "The records are a separate matter." She opened the ledger to page 31. "They document the gradual substitution of a compound in the Court Healer's cabinet beginning 11 months ago. The compound that was removed is used to support a newborn's cough reflex. The compound that replaced it suppresses it. The substitution is consistent, measured, and recorded here in the same hand and the same ink and the same daily notation format as every other entry in this ledger, which spans 4 years and approximately 1,600 entries." She looked at the council members, not at Lady Corveth, because she was not interested in Lady Corveth's expression right now. "I would also note," she said, "that archivist Fenwick has held a copy of this ledger's index pages in his archive since the 2nd year of my appointment, as is standard practice for all medical records generated in the lower ward. He can confirm that the index has not changed." The side door opened. Leofric came in without announcement, which he was entirely within his rights to do, and which the council clearly had not expected. The room rose. Lady Corveth rose. Orla stayed seated because she had not finished, and Leofric looked at her across the table and said, "Let her finish." She finished. The hearing ran 3 hours. Old Fenwick was brought from his alcove. He arrived with 3 volumes of his own records under his arm, and the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for someone to ask him the right questions. He confirmed that Orla's ledger index had been held in his archive for 2 years and 8 months, unchanged, and that in 40 years of archiving at Kerth he had not encountered a more consistent or careful set of medical records. He also offered, unprompted, and with the particular authority of someone who has lived past caring about hierarchy, that the discrepancies she had documented were exactly the kind of discrepancies that a person would need to document over a long period of time to prove, and that he was glad someone had. The court healers were questioned. Their answers did not align with the records in 3 specific places they could not explain. The compound cabinet was brought to the chamber and inventoried in front of the full council. The substituted compound was identified and weighed and found to be present in a quantity consistent with 11 months of gradual replacement. Lady Corveth's counsel spoke for some time about precedent and station, and the appropriate channels through which concerns of this nature ought to be raised. He was precise and measured, and everything he said was technically correct, and at the end of it, Orla felt, with some clarity, that technically correct and entirely insufficient often turned out to be the same thing. The council voted at the end of the 4th hour. The petition against Orla was struck from record in its entirety. Lady Corveth's appointment to the role of prospective mate was placed under formal review, pending full investigation. The court healer was suspended from practice immediately. A complete audit was ordered of all compounds administered within Kerth hold in the preceding 12 months. None of these outcomes were spectacular. They were procedures. They were the institution doing the thing that institutions can do when someone places an accurate enough record on the table in front of them, and then waits with their hands in their lap to see what happens. Orla closed the ledger. Her hands were steady. She was surprised at first to notice this, and then she was not surprised. Leofric was standing 3 feet from her. He had not left the chamber after the vote. "You knew," he said. It was not an accusation, and it was not a question. It was an observation delivered with the precision of a man who has recently understood the shape of something he had been missing, and is accounting for the full cost of that. "I suspected," Orla said. "I kept records because suspicion is not proof, and proof is the only thing this room was going to listen to." She met his eyes. "I had to wait until the situation created a circumstance in which the records would be heard. That circumstance arrived 3 days ago, at the cost of your son nearly dying, which I understand was not what I would have chosen if I had been the one choosing." He was silent. He had the quality of a man who absorbs difficult truths completely, rather than deflecting them, and she found, watching it, that she trusted it. "How long were you waiting?" he said. 7 months, she said, "since I had enough recorded to constitute a pattern, rather than an observation." Outside the chamber windows, the castle's afternoon was doing what afternoon does. The particular slant of low light on stone, the bells from the east tower marking the 2nd hour past noon, horses moving in the distant courtyard, everything continuing in the steady, indifferent way of things that do not know what has just happened indoors. "My son's wolf found you on the 4th morning," Leofric said. "He had been placed in the solar for the day, and he crawled 3 feet across the floor to press his nose against your palm. He has done this every morning since." He looked at her with the expression she had seen in the lower ward, the measurement being taken. "Archivist Fenwick tells me that an Alpha King's wolf-born son has not chosen a companion in this way since the last Alpha Queen was alive at Kerth, 427 years. Orla said nothing, because she did not have anything accurate to say to that. "I want you to understand something," Leofric said. He was choosing his words with the deliberateness of someone who does not usually have to choose them carefully, and is making the effort because it matters. That is not why I am asking what I am about to ask. The wolf's preference is a fact. My son's preference is a fact. They are not the argument. What is the argument? Orla said. You kept a ledger for 7 months, he said. You kept it accurately, and you kept it alone, and you waited until the moment it would be heard, and then you walked into this room, and you set it on the table. He paused. I have not encountered many people who do that. Most people, when they are not being watched, take the easier path. He looked at her directly. Stay. Not because the wolf chose you, not because the records demanded it, because I am asking you to, as myself, and I would like to know whether you want to. Outside, the bells marked the hour. Orla thought of the ledger, of 11 months of careful, unwitnessed work in the lower ward before dawn, of the split seam in her left boot, of the infant in the grey morning light, and the sound he had made when his lungs decided to work, which was, without question, the best sound she had heard in 4 years at Kerth Hold, and possibly longer. Yes, she said, but I am keeping the ledger. Something in his face shifted. Not a smile, or not yet, but the first clear possibility of one. I would expect nothing else, he said. The months that followed did not resolve dramatically. They resolved in the way that good things generally resolve, gradually, specifically, with the occasional inconvenience and a great deal of ordinary work. Lady Corveth was tried before a formal tribunal at the end of the 2nd month. The proceedings lasted 4 days and were attended by council members from 3 of Kerth's allied territories and by an archivist from the Eastern Records Office who had, it emerged, been noting his own inconsistencies for some time. The sentence was a term of supervised custody and a permanent prohibition from any court position in the compact's jurisdiction. It was read without spectacle, recorded without flourish, and placed in Fenwick's archive, along with every other formal act of Kerth's institutional life. Lady Corveth's expression when the verdict was delivered was not defiance. It was the expression of someone who has spent a long time building something and has just watched it become evidence against them, and who is only now understanding, fully, what that means. Orla was not in the chamber for the verdict. She was in the lower ward, because there was a patient who needed her. She remained in the lower ward by choice, and by the habit of 4 years, though her situation changed in the ways Leofric had promised, and a few additional ones she had not expected. She was given a formal appointment as court healer to the heir, which was not a common position, and had required some creative interpretation of the existing protocols, which she gathered Leofric had managed with his usual efficiency. She was given a seat at the quarterly medical council, which she attended, and at which she was initially tolerated, and eventually consulted, and eventually, by the 5th month, listened to as a matter of course. She was given access to the upper compound stores. She was given a pair of boots made to measure by the castle cobbler, who fitted them precisely and asked no questions. She kept the old boots. She was not entirely certain why. Leofric's son was, by the 3rd month, as healthy as anyone at Kerth had seen an infant be. He had his father's quality of stillness when he chose to deploy it, which was rarely, because he was 4 months old and had a great many opinions about the world and the people in it. He had Orla's habit already of watching things carefully before deciding whether to engage. He had, from very early on, a wolf who treated Orla's shoulder as a perfectly reasonable place to sleep, and who tracked her movements across any room she entered with the patient attention of something that has decided a thing and has no interest in revisiting the decision. The wolf was small still, ears too large, paws too large, the general impression of a creature that has been assembled from parts slightly too big for its current size. It was going to be enormous. Leofric observed this with what Orla had come to recognize as private amusement, delivered matter-of-factly. "Fenwick says the last wolf of this lineage stood 4 feet at the shoulder," he said one evening. "I expect the shoulder will eventually be at a more convenient height," Orla said. "I am told it chooses that height based on the person it has claimed." She looked at him. He was watching the wolf, which had arranged itself across her feet, with the proprietary ease of something that has worked out the logistics and found them satisfactory. "I have been claimed by a wolf," Orla said. "You have been claimed by 2, if you are counting accurately," Leofric said, "though the second one is less demonstrative about it." He paused. "Arguably." She looked at the ledger on the table beside her. It was nearly full. She would need a new one soon. The thought was not alarming. Those months gave her something she hadn't known she had been missing. Not recognition exactly, though recognition was part of it, because she walked into rooms now, and the rooms registered her, the way rooms register people who have earned that kind of weight in them. It was not power in the way she had imagined power from the lower ward. It was simpler and more specific. It was the knowledge that what she observed mattered, and that when she wrote it down, someone would eventually read it. Leofric told her things in the way she had come to understand was his particular form of intimacy, deliberate and matter-of-fact, delivered the way he delivered reports, containing more than they appeared to. The state of the Northern Road, the eldest councillor's complicated history with the concept of apology and what he had decided to do about it, his opinion, carefully worded and slightly dry, that the wolf was going to be larger than him, and that he found this more satisfying than it probably should. She told him things too, in her own way, precise, unadorned, without softening the parts that were difficult. What the compound records showed at their full extent, once the audit had run. What she had seen from the position of someone no one was watching, over 4 years, and what it had cost her in patience, and in the particular loneliness of knowing something you cannot yet prove. What it had felt like to sit in the lower ward with a ledger and a locked cabinet, and the sustained conviction that the only distinction between patience and defeat was whether you kept writing. He listened. He had a quality of attention, the same quality the wolf had, she thought, though she didn't say this. That was full and uninterrupted. He did not fill silences. He did not reach for the comfortable interpretation. He took what she said as what she meant, and weighed it accordingly. One morning in the 4th month, she sat in the east window seat, with the child against her shoulder, and the wolf asleep across her feet, and the ledger open on the stone ledge beside her, writing the morning's entries in the slant grey light. She could hear Leofric's voice from the council room at the far end of the corridor, low and precise and unhurried, managing some matter of the Northern Compact, with the steady authority of a man who has learned that the most powerful thing in a room full of voices is the willingness to wait until something true can be said. The wolf's ear twitched in its sleep. The child breathed against her collar with the easiness of something that has never doubted its right to do so. She made the last entry of the morning and set the quill in its rest, and looked out through the old glass at the courtyard below. The winter that had been so long and careful was, without announcement or ceremony, beginning to turn. The light had a different quality, still cold, but no longer empty. The kind of light that is moving towards something. She was not overlooked anymore. She knew this not from what people said to her, though they said more now and differently, but from the quality of the attention when she entered rooms. She had not become someone else to achieve it. She had the same ink on her wrists and the same split-seam boots, which she was going to repair soon, but not today. She had simply kept the records with great accuracy and considerable patience until the moment came to set them on a table, and then she had set them on a table. It was not a dramatic thing in the end. It was the most ordinary kind of courage there is, the kind that looks exactly like doing your job, very carefully, for a long time, in the belief that eventually it will matter. The ledger's last page was in sight. She would begin a new one tomorrow. If you found a record that could change everything, and carrying it meant walking into a room full of power without being asked, could you have done it? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time.